So now we get to our speaker for the night. Some of you might recognize this motley crew, not including the guy on the left who was our guide, Josh Engel. So this was when we were in Minnesota in January of 2020, just before the pandemic started.
Ken, Scott, Marianne, my roommate, Ewan.
Hi, David.
Oops, sorry.
That's okay.
Let me silence.
So we had a fabulous trip. So I asked Josh to give us a talk, and so he graciously agreed to talk about one of his favorite topics, birds of South Africa. So Josh is the founder and chief guide for Red Hill Birding. He grew up birding in the suburbs of Chicago. He developed this interest at a young age, and he spent a semester studying abroad in Ecuador as an undergraduate, and after graduation found a job guiding in Ecuador for a while. Then in South Africa, he spent nearly 4 years as a full-time guide, leading trips through Southern Africa, Madagascar, Asia, and beyond. He's guided trips on 4 continents and conducted bird research around the world. Prior to starting Red Hill Birding, Josh was an ornithologist at the Field Museum in Chicago. I think he might still have an affiliation with them, I'm not sure. Based in Chicago, he typically spends at least a month every year leading tours in South Africa. So I'm very pleased that Josh would agree to do this. We had a great time in Minnesota. And
can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Maybe
Yes.
some. All right, that's good. One of the best things about South Africa is that you do not have to wear quite as many layers as we had to wear in Minnesota, where it is very, very cold in winter. So yeah, thanks Scott so much for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure. There's something comforting about how bird club meetings are sort of the same everywhere. I grew up in the Evanston North Shore Bird Club, just in the northern suburbs of Chicago, which is where I live once again. Yeah, so Scott invited me here to talk about birds of South Africa, which is a place that is very near and dear to my heart. Let me just make sure I can share my screen. I was lucky enough, Scott mentioned that I started working as a birding guide in Ecuador, and I was there for 6 months, and then the company that I worked for, what they really needed was somebody who was willing to move across the pond, so to speak, and set up shop in South Africa. So I moved from Ecuador to South Africa, where I spent over 3 years based in the city of Cape Town. In the southwest of South Africa, and I got to know the country really well, and just really love the birding and the wildlife and the natural places in South Africa. And Scott mentioned also that under normal circumstances, I get back to South Africa every year.
We're not on camera.
Sorry, sorry, Josh, just a second. I'm sorry, if you're not Josh, please mute yourselves.
So when I moved back to Chicago from South Africa in 2010, I got a job at the Field Museum studying African birds. And at that time, I didn't know if I would ever get back to South Africa. And yet somehow I managed to get back there every single year since then, until a global pandemic got in the way. And so last year, 2020, was the first time in many, many years that I had not been back to South Africa. But I have a couple trips planned for this year. I'm hoping that they go ahead, but that still does remain to be seen to some extent. So anyway, on with my talk. The birding in South Africa is tremendous. And one thing that I love about it is that you can combine it with seeing wildlife. You know, when I was a kid getting into birding, I loved all animals, and I still do. So getting to take birders around South Africa where you get to also see all the great wildlife is a real special thing for me. So that's sort of why I call the talk Birding on Safari. And I picked as my title slide a real iconic bird of South Africa. It's called a Cape sugar bird, there with that remarkable tail. And one reason I picked that for my title slide is that it's also the bird in the logo of my company, Red Hill Birding. And you can a little bit get a sense of the habitat that it lives in. You can see the mountains behind it. Much of South Africa, especially the area around Cape Town where I lived and where this bird occurs is really beautiful and mountainous. And it's one of only 2 species of sugar birds in the world, both of which almost only live in South Africa. Just a little bit of background about the country of South Africa itself. It's been inhabited by modern humans for a very, very long time. There's an area that's known as the cradle of humankind in South Africa where you can visit. There's a museum about the early human habitation going back 100,000 years or more. Of course, like much of Africa, has a fraught colonial history, but it was one of the earliest countries to have independence from the European colonialists. And the Union was created in 1910, yet it took until 1994 to actually become the modern democracy that it is today after apartheid ended. And of course, the first president was Nelson Mandela, much beloved global figure who I'm sure all of you know about. They try to be very inclusive in South Africa. So one of the manifestations of that is that there are 11 official languages. But the primary language of business and of tourism is English. So it's actually very easy to communicate there once you get used to the accent, because almost everyone that you will encounter speaks English. And it's a pretty big country. It's about twice the size of Texas. So of course, the projections on our maps make Africa look a little bit smaller than it is in reality, and especially South Africa all the way to the southern tip. But it's actually a really big country. So to get across the country, if you're trying to see different parts of it as a tourist, you end up getting on a flight or two and flying around a bit. And it was the host of the 2010 World Cup. I lived there. I actually left South Africa in early 2010, just before the World Cup. But one thing that the World Cup brought was a great investment in the infrastructure there. So they modernized a lot of the airports, fixed up a lot of the big roads, and that sort of improved infrastructure lasts until today. It's just as a birder and as a wildlife lover, nature enthusiast, just an amazing place to visit. On a tour that lasts, say, 2 or 2.5 weeks, you can rack up 400 species of birds at a relatively leisurely pace, and even 50 different species of mammals, which is something that you can pretty much only do in Africa to get a mammal list that's that big. It has a whole lot of endemics, a whole lot of birds that are found nowhere else in the world except Lesotho and the 2 countries that are almost entirely encompassed by it. Lesotho is entirely encompassed by South Africa, and Swaziland, which is now called Eswatini, is mostly encompassed by South Africa. So there's about 70 birds that are only found in that part of the world, and many more that are only found in this what's called the sub-region of Southern Africa, which includes the countries just to the north of South Africa. Everywhere you look, the scenery is spectacular. This particular photo is from Karoo National Park, which is the desert ecosystem inland from the coast in the western part of South Africa. It's a very arid environment and very mountainous and rugged. And that's actually the hotel that's in the national park there, those bungalows that you see in the background. Like I mentioned, it has incredible mammal viewing on par with the famous safari areas in East Africa with all the big megafauna that you associate with African wildlife and African national parks. It has amazing pelagic trips into the ocean, especially off Cape Town, which is something that I was lucky enough to take part in many times when I lived there. And it's just a really lovely country to travel in. The accommodations are always really nice. Each one is different than the next. They're all interesting and really lovely. Everyone is super welcoming. The food is delicious, mostly very familiar to Western palates, but there's also some uniquely South African food. So it just makes for a really nice trip, a nice place to travel. The roads are also very good, which cannot be said about many places in Africa. In terms of birding itself, the birding is great all year. There really is no bad time to go, although generally peak birding season is the southern spring, the austral spring, which is roughly October to December. That's when migrants are arriving from the north, both from the northern hemisphere as well as from further north in Africa. It's also when the breeding season is starting, so birds are a bit more vocal. But really, any time of year is good. And each time of year has some pluses and some minuses. It also has great climate. You will never have to wear big winter boots or really warm stocking hats. And it's just, that helps too. It does get hot some places sometimes a year. It gets a little cool some places sometime a year. The rainy season gets a little bit wet, but really it's just generally a pretty arid environment. So the rainy season never interferes too much with travel. And really in some places it can be really spectacular to watch some of these rainy season storms as they move across the horizon. I'm going to talk about the three main birding areas in South Africa. Of course, you can see that only encompasses part of the country, and there are great birds everywhere. But as an international visiting birders, typically they visit 1, 2, or all 3 of these places on a single trip. If you were really to do a thorough job of visiting all 3 places, you'd probably be there for 3.5 or 4 weeks. So most people condense it and just do highlights in 1 or 2 or 3 of these areas. And I'm going to go through them one by one, starting in the Cape. And it's a lot to talk about, so I'm going to be talking pretty fast. First I want to talk about why South Africa is so great, especially the Cape where I lived. And here's a map. This is just a little map of the floral kingdoms, as they're called, of the world. And you can see that little red one down at the bottom of Africa that encompasses just a little bit of land. That's where Cape Town is. It has a really unique plant community that has various habitats associated with it. The best known is called the fynbos, F-Y-N-B-O-S, which means fine bush in Afrikaans. And consequently, because of the unique plants, there's a lot of unique birds and unique other things as well. This is a map that shows just various habitat types of Africa. You don't need to really look at all the details, except to note that in South Africa, down at the bottom, there's a whole lot of different colors going on because there's a lot of different unique ecosystems here. Here's a little bit of a stylized, zoomed in version just on the country of South Africa itself with its 6 different major biomes. And it is possible to hit all of those different biomes in a single trip if you want to take your time. So I'm going to start with these. There's the 3 regions, the Cape, what I call the Northeast, and KwaZulu-Natal. And we're going to start down in the Cape, which has in itself many different areas. And the ones that I'm going to talk about are listed there. And we're going to start in Cape Town. This is a view across Table Bay towards Table Mountain. Table Mountain is the primary geological feature of Cape Town. It dominates over the city itself, which you can just make out at the base of the mountain, and it's often referenced as used as a reference for location within the area. And this is actually the beach of this photo, which I did not take, is the view from the beach near where I lived when I lived there, looking across Table Bay at that beautiful view. And you can of course see why it's called Table Mountain, because it is sort of table shaped, although when you actually get to the top itself, it does not look flat by any means. And this is the view looking the other direction from the top of Table Mountain across Table Bay. And here you can get a better sense of just how big the city is. Cape Town is a city of about 2 million people. The other areas around there are the Garden Route, which is a lush ecosystem to the east of Cape Town, and the Karoo, which is a very dry ecosystem in the rain shadow of the coastal mountains. So we're going to start talking about Cape Town and the Garden Route, which is really dramatic looking, especially on the coast. A lot of people say it reminds them of coastal California. Very rugged, mountainous, rocky, right up to the coast. Really make for spectacular scenery. One of the most famous places to go birding in Cape Town itself is the Botanic Gardens. It's, for my money, the most beautiful botanic gardens in the world, but to be fair, I haven't been to all of them, but it is just really spectacular. It's right at the foot of Table Mountain, so you can get a little bit of a sense of that in the scenery shot. That's a Cape Robin chat, like a lot of these urban, semi-urban areas that have a lot of nice habitat. The birds can be quite tame, so that's always one of the first stops when I'm in the area, because it's just great birding, great for photography, beautiful scenery, and you can get a real good sense of that fynbos habitat that I mentioned. One of the most prominent plants of which is the proteas, and these are protea flowers in the scenery shot. The orange-breasted sunbird is an endemic bird to the Cape. It's only found in that coastal fynbos habitat, coastal and mountain fynbos habitat in the southwestern part of South Africa. And they specialize on drinking the nectar from proteas and other local flowers there. It's just a beautiful bird. You see a lot of different sunbirds as you travel across South Africa, but that's a really special one because it's only there, and it has that really beautiful combination of green, purple, and orange. And it's also pretty common even in urban areas in patches of good habitat. This is, well, you can't see the photo that's in the background, but you can sort of see the same thing. I'm going to show a little video here. The pelagic birding is some of the best in the world. In a single day, you get about 20 to 30 miles offshore. And as you go out in your pelagic boat, what you're really doing is aiming for a fishing trawler. And the birds are all concentrated and swirling around the trawler. And it just makes for a spectacular scene. I'm going to play this video. Hopefully it will work. Yeah, you should be able to hear it as well. Yeah, the noise of the water and the engine are going to be a bit loud if your volume is up, but I'm just going to play that one more time. You can get a real sense of the volume of pelagic birds. Those are primarily white-chinned petrels. That's by far the most numerous bird offshore of South Africa. If you are really looking carefully, you'll see some black and white birds. You can also see them in that background photo. Those are primarily Cape gannets, but you might be, if you're particularly eagle-eyed, you might be able to pick out a few other birds. I think you should be able to see my cursor here. I'm circling a Cape petrel down here on the left. Here's a Wilson storm petrel, the lower left. But it's just amazing to have your boat surrounded by masses and masses of birds and to be totally out of sight of land at the same time. And for birders, of course, you know, we love albatross. They're real symbols of the open ocean, and you do see quite a few albatross here. This is a yellow-nosed albatross, which is one of the less common ones, but you do see it most trips. The two most common albatross that you see offshore there are shy and black-browed albatross. And of course, they're just these magnificent, enormous birds that are just, to me at least, really evoke the open ocean. And really, you really know you're on a pelagic trip when you're seeing albatross. But the coastal ecosystems are really rich as well, largely for the same reason that the pelagic trips are so rich in bird life, because the cold water current, the Benguela current, brings nutrients from the southern oceans up along the western coast of South Africa and feeds all these, all the different layers of the food web. And the result is that there's both lots of life offshore and on the shoreline itself. And there's several different species of endemic cormorants there. This is in the top, that's a Cape cormorant carrying nesting material. And then the bottom is a African cormorant, which if you've been to the West Coast, birding on the West Coast of the United States will remind you of our own black oyster catcher. Sorry, I meant African oyster catcher is what that one is. But the most famous of the coastal residents is the African penguin, which used to be called the jackass penguin, named after its braying sound that sounds a bit like a donkey. And there's only the vast majority of African penguins, which now are sadly endangered because of changes to the ocean. Most of them nest on islands offshore, but there are a few places where they have adapted to onshore life, coastal life. And one of those is actually just in the suburbs of Cape Town along the Cape Peninsula, south of the city itself. And not only is it a very popular tourist location, because who doesn't love a penguin? It's a great place to go for birders to go to see the penguins as well as other coastal birds. And here you can see a big group right on a sandy beach, adults and young ones and molting birds. There's a lot of great birds, though, all throughout the area in all the different habitats. There's some really wonderful grassland habitats around there. And there's some endemic birds there. One is the black harrier in the top left, a very striking raptor. And you can also get into bustards, which are a family of ground-dwelling birds found in Africa and Asia and Australia. And this is a southern black korhan, as they call it there, which is only found in the coastal strip of land around the Cape. And there's a lot of wetlands there too. You probably don't associate flamingos with the temperate ecosystems of the southernmost part of Africa, but there's a lot of flamingos there. This is a flock of greater flamingos at one of those great birding destinations, the sewage lagoons. Cape Town has one of the best sewage lagoons for birding anywhere, and they're very welcoming of birders, which is always a nice touch. As we move along the coast a little bit, we get into some more really beautiful habitat. I love this sign because, in private areas, birders are not always welcome, but, you see a very prominent sign, private properties, no access to the sea, but birders are welcome. And not only are birders welcome, they tell you what you want to go there to look for, which is Cape rockjumper, which is sort of like Cape sugarbird. There's 2 species of rockjumpers in the world. Both of them are almost only found in South Africa. And those 2 are both ancient lineages of passerines, and each one has 1 species in the Cape and 1 species in the mountains of eastern South Africa. And so this is where you go to look for a Cape rockjumper, and you just take this walk. It's just a 1-lane gravel road that gets a few people to their coastal homes, but birders can walk along there, and it's a beautiful walk, very dramatic scenery and wonderful bird life. And every birder who goes there really wants to see Cape rockjumper, and that's a place where many birders have gotten their lifer Cape rockjumper, and it's a beautiful bird too, with that orange belly and blood red eye. There's a lot of great birds in that ecosystem. As a Cape grassbird on the top right, and a bird that still goes by its South African name, Buck McKeary, which is a species of bushshrike. And both of those are found in that coastal scrub habitat in South Africa. And both of those are also only found in Southern Africa. And as you move farther east, you get into agricultural areas, which are a great place to see South Africa's national bird, which is blue crane. At one point, they were quite rare, but there's been a lot of efforts there, especially educational efforts in the farming communities there, to get farmers to understand that the blue cranes do not compete with the livestock. You can see the sheep in the background there. They also live in areas where there's a lot of ostrich farming. So to educate the farmers that the blue cranes don't compete or transmit diseases to the livestock. And it's been a great success. And now there's blue cranes all over that particular part of South Africa, which is a really nice story. And there's just a lot of great grassland birds there as well. That the bird in the top left is a Cape longclaw. It might remind you of a meadowlark. It is indeed very, very similar looking. It lives in similar habitats, even sounds sort of similar. And in the bottom right is one of the many larks that you will look for if you go on a birding tour of South Africa. This particular one is called a Gullis long-billed lark, which has a very tiny distribution in a small part of South Africa. But fortunately, it's pretty common there. So we do see it on most trips. And everywhere you go in South Africa, there's interesting mammals to see. I didn't show pictures of whales, but the Cape, especially those pelagic trips in the coastal areas are great for seeing whales. But there's also a lot of national parks and provincial parks that are great places to see other wildlife. That's an antelope that's only found in South Africa on the top, called a bontebok, male and female. And then there's always cool little mammals to see too. And those are yellow mongoose down at the bottom. Continuing east, we get into a much moister habitat of humid rainforest or humid forest along the garden route. We used to stay there in a little B&B. It was one of my favorite places to stay anywhere, but unfortunately, the owners retired and sold it. And as far as I know, it has not reopened, partially because of the pandemic. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with it in the future, but it was a great place. There's not a lot of places that have bird feeders in Africa, partially because if you put out bird seed in a lot of places, all you attract are monkeys, and that's no good. But here they have these amazing bird feeders that attract a lot of wonderful birds, like the Swi waxbill down on the bottom. They also had a fork-tailed drongo that they had trained to eat out of your hand. There I am, also with long hair, but a long time ago, feeding fork-tailed drongo. It's sitting on my fingers, and I was feeding it grated cheese. That particular hotel, I think, is the only place I've ever been where they used cheese as a bird food, but it really works. But the big attraction at that particular hotel and that particular forest area is Knysna turako, just a spectacular bird. Maybe some of you know turacos from Africa, or guans and chachalakas from the Americas. They behave sort of like guans and chachalakas, but they're a lot more colorful. I always think of it as looking like it's wearing a lot of makeup, nice makeup. And this bird is actually eating a wild fruit from a yellowwood tree, but it's eating it in the yard of that hotel. But one of the great things about that part of South Africa, and especially the hotel that I mentioned before, is that the turacos come to feeders there because besides seed and cheese, they also feed fruit to the animals. And when you watch, this is a slow motion video of a Turaco picking up I think it's a piece of apple from the feeder, but the bird is blue and green and it's really beautiful, but it's real striking when it flies. You see that amazing flash of red. I mean, almost their entire wings are red, and that's hidden when they sit. So just a really, one of those surprising and unexpected things that you see when you're out birding. Just showing you one more time. And I just took that with my phone. You know, I'm just standing 5 or 8 feet away from that on the balcony of the hotel. From there, you actually go over some mountains, and all of a sudden you are no longer in forest habitat. You're in what is basically desert, and it's called the Karoo. And it's a very rocky, mountainous habitat, starkly beautiful, very dry, not great for agriculture because it's so dry, although there is some sheep farming that goes on up there, but there's a whole set of birds. And if you're a botanist, many, many plants that are unique to this ecosystem. So it does make a real interesting visit for birders. And primarily you're looking for birds that like rocks. There's a lot of birds there that are found only in rocky habitats. This is a cinnamon-breasted warbler. You can see how its color matches the rocks that it lives on. This is a ground woodpecker. Sort of like our flicker, it spends a lot of time on the ground, although this one is particularly fond of areas with rocks, and it even nests in rock crevices. You also see a lot of mammals, especially these rock hyrax, little things that look like rodents. They're not, but they look like rodents and live in rocky habitats. And any places where you have rock hyrax, you have their primary predators, Verreaux's eagle, which also nests on cliffs in that sort of habitat. And you get out into the lower areas, the more flat areas, or water courses, which are dry most of the time, which have scrub along them, and you get into a whole another set of unique birds. For example, sand grouse, that's a Namaqua sand grouse on the left. Some interesting raptors. You have a pale chanting goshawk on the right. And one of my favorites, the little fairy flycatcher down there on the left, which always reminds me of gnatcatchers when I see them. They're tiny and hyperactive, and they have long, narrow tails, just like gnatcatchers. And like I mentioned earlier, and we'll mention again, cool mammals everywhere. This is an endemic zebra called a Cape Mountain zebra that also lives in the rocky habitats in the Karoo. So now I'm going to move on to the northeast part of South Africa, which takes a 2-hour flight. Well, it depends on where you're going from and going to, but if you're flying like I do on many of my trips from Cape Town to Johannesburg, it's about a 2-hour flight and you land in Johannesburg, which is the biggest city in South Africa. It is also not a very nice city. So the vast majority of the time, you just use it as a launching pad, spend a night there and get out early the next morning, although it does have great birding on the outskirts of the city as well. So some trips we do take advantage of that. And the two primary habitats that you're in this part of South Africa are the high veld, which is a high elevation grassland, and the low veld, which is the lower elevation habitat, often called the bushveld. And here you can see sort of iconic mammals of both of these habitats, slightly different sized animals. You see the meerkats on the top, the family of meerkats, and the family of elephants down on the bottom. So we're going to start up in the high veld in Wakkerstroom, which is just a tiny little town that really gets a little bit of weekend tourism from Johannesburg, but it's primarily a place that birders know about, and has just really high quality grasslands. Has a lot of overgrazed grasslands as well, but there's still a lot of high quality grasslands. And sometimes I wonder, as we're driving around these grassland habitats in eastern South Africa, how anyone ever saw birds before there were fences. But somehow those birds managed to survive, and people probably could see them, because you do spend a lot of time looking at birds perched on fences and fence posts. The bird on the top is this magnificent and very common bird called the long-tailed widow bird. One of the advantages of going during the breeding season is that they have their breeding finery, which is their black plumage with a very long tail. In the non-breeding season, they look basically female house sparrow. The one on the bottom is a sentinel rock thrush, which is another South African endemic. There's also, you spend a lot of time looking for, like I mentioned earlier, larks. There's a lot of larks, little brown jobs, all over South Africa. Many of them are quite localized and quite rare. This is Botha's lark, which is now these days a highly endangered species because of conversion of the high quality grasslands to pastures and other forms of agriculture. And in the Wakkerstrom area, encroaching settlement, actually, they have very specific habitat needs, which is never good for a bird, at least for the longevity of a species. But there are a lot of people working there, especially BirdLife South Africa, which is the big conservation organization in South Africa, working to protect birds like this adorable Botha's lark, which is a real tough bird to find. A lot of big birds out in these grasslands too. On the bottom there is another endemic, the southern bald ibis. It's actually a cliff nesting bird, and there's not really any cliffs anywhere near there, but they fly a great distance to feed around the correct grasslands. Really a strange looking bird, but with beautiful glossy plumage and that funny red bare skin on the head that sort of looks like a toupee. And there's more bustards there. This is a white-bellied bustard in the top left, typical. But bustards are, there's quite a diversity of them around Africa, but almost all of them are found in grassland habitats. Most of them are found in grassland habitats. And here we are, a few of us, on one of my trips with a local guide, Norman, in the Wakkerstrom area. And we're actually looking at white-bellied bustard or white-bellied korhaan in this picture. And that one does okay in some areas where there's some cattle grazing, but other birds do not do so well in areas with grazing. And another bird, an iconic African bird that you look for in grasslands in Wakkerstrom, as well as in Kruger, which I'll be talking about next. Secretary bird is just, it's a really classic grassland bird in Africa. You hear different reasons about why it's called secretary bird, but it may be because those funny feathers on the head that you can see in the lower photo look like quills that were used for writing. Sometimes you hear that the black feathers on its thighs resemble something that that secretaries wore in Europe back in the day. But whatever, it's really an amazing bird that goes around hunting with its feet. It's a predator that eats things like insects, snakes, lizards, and it hunts them with its feet. And they become pretty uncommon as the grasslands have been converted to other human modified ecosystems, and but they're still pretty reliably found in some parts of South Africa, including in Wakkerstrom. And then from Wakkerstrom, which is up at about 5,000-ish feet elevation, you drop down the escarpment and you end up in the Lowveld, which is much lower elevation, especially focused in Kruger National Park. And Kruger is sort of the flagship national park for South Africa. It's the first national park there. It's the most famous wildlife park in all of South Africa. It's enormous. It's about the size of the state of Connecticut. And it has a really nice tourist infrastructure that caters to various budgets and various interests. But it's a great place to see lions and other charismatic megafauna that Africa is so famous for. It also has great birds. Any large protected area is going to have interesting birds. And unlike many other areas of South Africa, it's not a place that you really focus on endemics. Many of the birds are widespread. But what it does have is big populations of a lot of birds that have become rare outside of large protected areas. So storks and raptors and various other big bustards and various other big birds. One of those is this brown-headed parrot. I actually photographed this right in one of the camps in South Africa, which are the public areas with simple lodging and restaurants where people can stay. And they are completely fenced in from the wildlife so that you are protected from the wildlife, as well as, I suppose, the wildlife being protected from the tourists. But brown-headed parrot is one of the birds that Kruger is famous for. Another one is just about my favorite bird in the world, southern ground hornbill. They're bizarre. They're really strange. Sometimes you see adults like this one walking around carrying prey. So this one you can see is carrying a frog in its beak, and it looks like maybe it has some other larvae in its beak as well. And they're just really strange birds. They have wonderful calls. They're about turkey size. They live on the ground. just a lot of strange things about them. And like the Turaco where I showed, that's a green bird, green blue bird, but when it flies, it shows a big red patch in its wings. Southern ground hornbills are entirely black until they fly, and they show a big white patch in their wing, which is very striking. But those camps that I mentioned where people stay are really wonderful places for birding. The birds get used to people. Some of them will beg scraps from your picnic tables, but they're just great places for birding. These are a couple of the typical camp birds. It's a crested barbet on the top and a blue-eared glossy starling on the bottom. Some more birds from Kruger. The one on the bottom, lilac-breasted roller, is sort of the classic African safari bird. It's the one that every safari guide everywhere in Africa knows. Even non-birders, when they go off on safari, they'll come back with a couple of bird photos, right? Always there's going to be an ostrich photo in there, and there's always going to be a lilac-breasted roller photo in there. And they're spectacular and they're conspicuous. So it's really nice to have them around. And if you're there during the austral summer when migrants are around, they get mixed in with European rollers, which migrate from the Mediterranean region or southwestern Asia down to southern Africa for the winter. That's the bird in the top left. Kruger is an amazing place for raptors. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of big birds that have become rare outside of big protected areas that are still common in Kruger and in some of the other big protected areas in South Africa. One of those is Martial eagle. That's an adult Martial eagle in the bottom right. For some reason, I paired it up here with one of the smallest raptors in all of South Africa, the pearl spotted owlet, which is quite a common owl that you find in the low veld and bushveld habitats throughout Africa, including in Kruger and other places in South Africa. You may have heard about the plight of vultures in India and in Africa. There's been huge declines in vulture populations in these places for various reasons. There are many various reasons. In Africa, they get hunted for medicinal purposes, besides other reasons. But anyway, in the top left, there's 2 different kinds of vultures out of the 5 that you can find in Kruger. And again, I mentioned this a minute ago, having a huge protected area like Kruger is critical for conservation, not just of the mammals that are there, but also of birds. And that includes vultures. They're well protected there. They have a lot of prey there because of the predator-prey interactions of the big cats and other predators. The 2 that sort of look like evil clowns on the right and the left are white-headed vultures, and the real big guy in the middle is the lappet-faced vulture. And in the bottom right is a bird that sort of looks like a vulture because it has red bare skin on its face, but is actually more closely related to hawks and eagles. That is a bataleur, a uniquely shaped raptor. That's another one of these birds that is still pretty common in Kruger, but rare elsewhere. Some of those other big birds that you can find there are Kori bustards, which are the heaviest flying bird. There's a pair of them in the top left, and that beautiful saddle-billed stork. You get a lot, you never know what a day is going to hold when you're on a safari. In Kruger, for the most part, most places in Kruger, you cannot get out of your vehicle. So I've shifted in recent years from using a van to hiring a driver and an open-sided safari vehicle there. It makes for a better experience because you can see better and you sort of get to experience the wildlife and the habitats better. But they also have a series of what they call hides, or what we would call blinds there, which are great places especially for birding and photography, because they're often situated over wetlands. This was a blind that we just went there, and it happened to have a herd of elephants all around it. And yes, you have to walk. Yeah, I took a selfie with elephants. You have to walk a little bit from your vehicle to get to the blind. And of course, there were no elephants when we walked into the blind, and we got there and they came all around, and we had to wait for them to leave before we could get back to our vehicles. But that's an experience that you have when you're in a place like that. But there's a lot of big animals there. It has one of the biggest populations of rhinos, just like vultures. You may have heard a lot about the plight of rhinos in Africa. It's really devastatingly sad how rhinos have been poached for their horns. But there's still a pretty healthy population in Kruger, although they have not been immune. Excuse me, they've not been immune to the same poaching issues that have plagued other places in Africa. Those are 3 very muddy white rhinos on the left. There are black rhinos there too, but they're rare. And there's tons of Cape buffalo there, many of which are accompanied by oxpeckers. Here you see an oxpecker that was trying to find parasites that had gone up the buffalo's nose, and I think the buffalo seems to be quite enjoying it. There's lots of just tons of animals there. Some zebra. This is a different species of zebra than I showed before. This is the plain zebra, which is the more widespread species in the African savannas. And by far the most common animal that you see in Kruger is impala, which is the antelope in the bottom right. You only see one in that photo, but they're always in big groups, sometimes several hundred strong. And they make a very good prey base for all of the big predators in Kruger. Lots of giraffes and zebra there. You know, just like I've been saying, it's an important place for conservation in general. And giraffes and all the big animals are declining in Africa, so it's great to have a place where they're safe. And there's tons of little animals, little creatures to look for there. This is a dwarf mongoose on the left and a flat-necked chameleon. So you never want to neglect the little guys too, because there's a lot of those all around. But what Kruger is perhaps most famous for is the predators. Maybe not these predators. There's a hyena, female hyena, and a pup lying on the road, getting warmth from the road in the early morning sunshine, and an African wildcat down there on the bottom. Some places you can go out on night drives in Kruger, which gives you a great opportunity to see nocturnal animals that you can't see during the day. One of those is African wildcat. I took that picture on a night drive in South Africa, or a night drive in Kruger. And of course, there's the real famous predators. There's the cheetahs and the wild dogs, 2 of Africa's rarest large predators, both of which have pretty healthy populations in Kruger, but they're still quite rare there. Don't see them every trip, although we try. 2 of my favorite animals. And leopards, it's a fantastic place to see leopards, the incredible tree climbing cats. Here, this one had actually, its prey had dropped its prey, fallen to the ground, so it was going down to make sure it was protected from whatever other animals might be around trying to scavenge. And of course, lions. If you're real lucky, you'll see animals with prey there. National Geographic might make you think that you see that every trip, but unfortunately you don't. So you take some luck. This was a whole pride of lions that had taken down a giraffe, and they had spent several days guarding it and eating the meat from it. And I only saw it as it was getting a little bit rank and old. But here's looks like a young male lion eating some giraffe there. And the last place that I'm going to talk about is KwaZulu-Natal, which is the province in the eastern part of South Africa on the coast. Parts of it are quite tropical, but just like everywhere else in the country, you don't have to drive far to get to a very different ecosystem. Durban is the main city in this part of South Africa. It's the 3rd biggest city. And there's a lot of great places to bird, many of which are concentrated around Isimangaliso Wetland Park in the northernmost part of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as closer to the border with Lesotho, where you get into the Drakensberg Mountains. Parts of KwaZulu-Natal are heavily forested with different types of forest. There's some shorter stature forest on sandy soils, which has some unique birds. There's some humid forests, which have some other unique birds. This is one of my groups where a very tiny antelope called a blue duiker, which is the smallest antelope in South Africa. That's actually full size there, came and approached us as we were birding in one of the forested habitats. And there's some parks there where you're allowed to get out and walk around, even though they have all of the big animals. Most of the areas where you're allowed to walk are not heavily trafficked by those big animals, so you're pretty safe. You're much more likely to come across little guys like the banded mongoose there in the bottom. But you're always out looking for birds. There's a lot of cool big birds in this part of South Africa. There's crested guinea fowl, which is just a goofy looking bird with a Jerry Carroll hairdo. And there's a wide variety of hornbills in all over South Africa, especially eastern South Africa. Trumpeter hornbill is one of the humid forests in the eastern part of South Africa. And if you're a real serious birder, you want to go and look for those endemic birds, some of which can be quite difficult to find. These are two of the endemics that are only found in the sand forest habitat, which only exists in a very small part of eastern South Africa and southern Mozambique. That's a nearguard sunbird on the top and a pink-throated twin spot on the bottom. I really like those little finches. I think they're very dramatic looking, like that twin spot. And there's some beautiful grassland habitats and some mountains. Those are the Drakensberg Mountains in the background. We're birding in some grasslands here. This is one of my earlier trips many, many years ago. But I love going up into the mountains there. You go up a place called Sani Pass, and it just has spectacular habitat, wonderful birds. This is the slope of the Drakensberg going up the pass. And actually the whole slope is South Africa, but when you get up onto the crest, you're in a whole new country, Lesotho. You actually do have to bring your passport that day. And Lesotho is very accustomed to day trippers who just go in and out in the same day. So when you go into Lesotho, they actually stamp your passport in and out at the same time, so you don't have to stop on the way out. And there's a lot of great birds and wildlife there. One of the birds that's really famous for is lammergeier, or bearded vulture, which is a huge vulture that lives in scattered mountain ranges in Europe and Africa and Asia. This is the southernmost population. And there's some really cute little endemic rodents there called Sloggett's ice rat or Sloggett's vley rat that dig burrows. And birds then will go in and actually use the burrows as well when the rats leave them. But some of the real special birds up there, I mentioned Cape rock jumper and Cape sugarbird that you find in the Cape. Well, this is where you can go to see the eastern versions of those, the Drakensberg rock jumper and the Gurney's sugarbird, both of which are pretty reliably found there. Just wonderful, charismatic birds that are only found, you know, if you're seeing those birds, you're in a really cool and interesting place. And another endemic bird there is the Drakensberg siskin, which fortunately, the Sani Top Chalet, the highest pub in Africa, it's at, I can't remember off the top of my head, maybe 7,500 feet elevation. They throw birdseed out on the rocks just off the balcony where that attract Drakensberg siskin. So instead of stopping at the border post on your way out to get your passport stamped, you just stop in and have a beer at the highest pub in Africa before you head back down into South Africa. And you never know who you're going to meet. This is a Basotho herdsman who we met along the way. This was, again, one of my earlier trips there. And he actually stopped to ask if he could, this was way away from the chalet. He was on his way to the chalet. He stopped and asked if he could use my cell phone to make a phone call. He was riding his horse 15 kilometers, 10 miles, just to go to the chalet, the hotel there, to use a phone. But unfortunately, I didn't have cell service, so I couldn't really help him out. But nowadays, this was probably in 2008 or 2009. Nowadays, there is cell service almost everywhere, and I'm sure this guy has his own cell phone now, because things do change very quickly there. And then the sun is setting, and you head back down. There's, as I've mentioned several times, lots of beautiful scenery in South Africa. You've beautiful sunsets every evening. This is always one of my favorites as the sun sets over the Drakensberg Mountains. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for listening. That's the thank you in Zulu and in Afrikaans and in English, the three most common languages in South Africa. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. You can find, my company is called Red Hill Birding. I have Facebook and Instagram accounts, and I do have a trip coming up to South Africa. I think there's one spot left. Fortunately, South Africa has very low levels of coronavirus right now. So I'm hoping that my trips there that are going there this year actually run. And I have a private trip going just in July. So we're going to make that decision just in the next week or so. But things are fortunately looking up in South Africa right now. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get there. And you can also go to my website, redhillbirding.com, and see what other trips I have coming up. I do trips all over the world, all over North America and all over the world. Some of you have been on them, and some more of you are coming on trips coming up just in the next few months. So again, thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to stick around, answer any